Greetings and salutations, this is Emperor Vespasian and his trusty sidekick.
Hello.
This is our Soviet army. I'm going to do a quick series of videos like we've done with the Chinese and the, what's the other army we've got? Polish. Polish armies, and I just thought I'd start with an overview of this army. This is how the army stands at the moment. I would like to get another box of infantry and a unit of Russian cavalry, which I think would be quite fun to have. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. So this is the army displayed as we have it today. So it's a pretty decent sized army. Well, we obviously don't use everything at the same time because some of the stuff is sort of casted for different periods of the war, different theatres of the war. This is basically an overview. So you can see some of the vehicles are painted in white for the winter war and some of them are painted in green for summer. I was kind of loath to do that. I ended up with more vehicles than I was planning on having, and I decided that given that we're never going to use that many vehicles on the table at the same time in a game of bolt action, I may as well do a few up in winter colours as well. So that's where we are at the moment. Do you want to give a quick grand tour?
Me?
Yeah.
Of all people you could pick.
Oh, go on, let's see how good you are.
We'll start in the infantry.
Infantry, right?
Normal infantry. I don't know what to say about it. On to you.
Okay, right. We have the infantry in the middle. Just here. These are all three normal infantry units, 11-man squads, 1 unit of paratroopers, VDV, 1 unit of partisans. These are all the support units. Medic, 3 sections of anti-tank rifles, mortar, sniper rifles,
2
flamethrowers, and a forward observation. For command, we have a major, supported by 2 commissars, although the commissars are added to squads. They're not really part of the command.
True.
Yeah, so they're all down at the front. Then we have the big monster tanks at the back. 4 T-28s and 2 T-35s.
Yep.
They operated in units of 1 T-35 to 2 T-28s. They were designed to complement each other on the battlefield. Which is why the T-28 didn't carry an anti-tank gun. Nextly, we have the artillery. We have an anti-tank gun and a 203mm howitzer, which is possibly one of the most awesome guns ever.
Haven't used it yet.
We haven't used it yet, no. Tank-wise, we have 6 T-26s and 6 BT-7s and a T-26 flamethrower tank. On the other side, we've got 3 trucks, 1 truck with an anti-aircraft gun on it, and 5 armoured cars. I should really have more armoured cars to tanks because the Russians had roughly the same amount of armoured cars as they did tanks. So, but we've got 5. On the far side, you can see some gliders which have crashed, and at the very back, you can see the aircraft. We have 3 biplanes. One of them is a PO2, the others are IL-15s, standard ground attack aircraft for the Soviet army of the period, and 2 fighter planes, the IL-16s, which is probably Russia's best fighter at this moment. One of the better fighters in the world. Right, so anything more we should add to this before we move along to the... Oh, well, yeah, these are the unit cards. We have a card for each individual unit. We'll show you more of these when we do the mini videos. So we've got 1 card for every single unit. Because you never use everything at the same time, you just pick a few units when you fight a game of bolt action generally. You would just have 5 or 6 cards. But we have a card for each one, which is fun.
Yeah.
Right, so now we move on to the history side of things, don't we? The Soviet army began the war well, arguably slightly before everybody else did. The Russians were pretty much invading everybody in sight. They were gradually expanding their empire. They tried, and to some degree successfully, made inroads into China. They made inroads into the Japanese territory in Mongolia. They took Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. They tried to take Finland. They took bits of other countries. They were pretty belligerent, right up to the point where the Germans invaded them in Operation Barbarossa. The Russians were pretty much attacking everybody, threatening everybody, and then the Germans hit them coming the other way. So, so that's where we stand.
Which made the Russians concentrate on one thing.
Yeah, it kind of took Russia's time up. They weren't too worried about conquering the world at that point, with the German hordes scurrying over the border and firing guns at them. The Soviet army was a modern army. It had more aircraft than all the world's armies combined. In fact, it had more warplanes than all the aircraft in the world of other countries combined. They had so many planes, it was silly. Luckily, most of them quite old and a bit cranky, and they didn't have many really well-trained pilots. So that was a good thing for the world in general. They relied on attack. Basically, their overall battle plan was to just roll forwards, just keep attacking. When you reach a strong point, you just hammer it with heavy artillery, and then you move on, and you keep going, you keep moving. Quite similar to Blitzkrieg, but for the Russians, it was generally everything would advance at once. The tactics of the era. It's not a bad idea if your enemy does not have defence in depth, because once you overrun the outer defences, you can pretty much steamroll your way forwards. And during the Second World War, most of the times the Russians were stopped wasn't because the enemy stopped them, it's because they ran out of fuel. So they had to stop, bring all the fuel trucks up, refuel everything, and this would take several months to reorganise and get ready for the next attack, which is why it took the Russians so long to invade Germany. You can't advance with such a large army, such great distances, without bringing up lots of supply stuff. But this is the early war Soviet army, so it did rely heavily on artillery. We only have 2 pieces of artillery at the moment, but
we are working on that.
Yeah, but most artillery was off board anyway. For bolt action purposes, you don't need your heavy howitzers and stuff generally, because most artillery is off board. It's 8 miles away, giving fire support. So you don't really need to mass your artillery in one place. Mass your artillery for figure-wise. Unless you're fighting a defensive game where an artillery piece is in a defensive position and troops are attacking it, there's no real reason to have lots of artillery in games of bolt action, because it's really a skirmish game. Yeah?
Yeah.
There's no point going deeply into the history of it. You can read most of it yourself.
I'm probably going way more detail in separate ones.
Yeah, in the individual units tend to go a lot more to them, and I'll run through a lot more of that. Paratroopers are going to be important for our games because the Soviets employed large amounts of paratroopers.
And they are amazing.
They're pretty high firepowered. They're pretty good firepower wise.
I took out an entire Polish infantry unit with them.
Yeah. The Russians were the first country in the world to adopt paratroopers. The outbreak of the Second World War, they had about 1 million men trained to jump out of a plane. They didn't have the planes to drop the men, but there were a lot of glider schools and parachute schools where people used to go to for a hobby. And so they would jump out of perfectly good aeroplanes on the weekend just for fun.
I'd rather do the glider one than the jumping out of an airplane one.
Yeah. But they did have a lot of these. They had a lot of these people who trained in their spare time. So when they were called up to the army, you had people that already had that sort of training. So it was quite useful. Germany did the same. They had glider schools and schools where you practice driving armoured cars and stuff, which is a useful way of getting around the Versailles Treaty. The reason for the heavy tanks at the back was part of Soviet doctrine. The idea is that the enemy is going to have a very fortified forward position. Think of the Maginot Line, a huge line of turrets and pillboxes and stuff. And these tanks at the back, the T-35s and the T-26s, were designed to break things like the Maginot Line. So whatever you put up against them, they would break through. They were fitted with howitzers and anti-tank guns and machine guns, and they could basically make a big hole in enemy defences. And then the light tanks, these guys would come in and exploit the gap and just rush through en masse. That was the plot. So pretty terrifying army to fight. The reasons the Germans did so well was the Germans attacked the Russians while they were actually
preparing
at the front. Yeah, all the Russian troops and everything was deployed right at the German border.
No, planes were all docked and getting fueled.
Yeah, all the planes were on runways just over the German border, ready to launch. One aerodrome was so close to the German border that as the planes took off, the Germans were able to shoot them down with anti-aircraft guns. They were that close to the German border, so the Germans just shot the planes out of the sky as they took off. So they were really deployed at the front line rather than in depth. They weren't deployed in a defensive manner. So the Germans were able to hit them before soldiers were literally running to try and get in their tanks, and the German panzers would drive down the road and machine gun them as they were trying to get in their tanks. It didn't help also that there was a military exercise planned for the Russian army, and during the invasion, when the invasion first started, the first day or so, when people heard bombs dropping and planes flying over, they thought it was part of the exercise, so they just ignored it and they didn't tell the men to get ready. So that was another thing which didn't help the Russians. And then the Russians were pretty much on the back foot right up to, I would say, Brody, where they launched their first real major counter-offensive. The Russians did launch constant offensive simply because High Command was the Stavka, the High Command of the Soviet Army, kept telling people to attack. But they were attacking piecemeal in small units. So they weren't able to gather the resources, gather all the forces together to really hit the Germans until the Battle of Brody, which is the biggest tank battle in history.
They say Kursk was the biggest.
Yeah, they say Kursk is because they never read a book. And the Russians very much covered up Brody because it was such an absolute disaster that the Russians really didn't want to talk about it. I think there were about 3,500 tanks for the Soviets, with about another 3,000 in reserve, and that's not including armoured cars. And Russian armoured cars are tanks, basically, so you double the number of tanks usually. And the Germans just managed to take them on gun for gun and win. More due to luck of deployment. As it happened, the Germans were moving their troops south at the very time the Russians attacked, so the Germans were able to have troops behind which could support defensive and offensive action. So this is the Soviet army. We have had quite a few fun games with it so far. I'm talking to you.
Yes, I love mass.
What?
I love the mass.
Mass. Oh, mass of numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, any thoughts and views?
Personally, I think these are my second best army. I have more.
What's your best?
Japanese.
Japanese
by far.
Yeah. We need to redo the Japanese.
The only reason I like Japanese the most is because they have the initiative of the attack. And they can bonsai charge, which is just awesome because it just, wherever you're fighting in bonsai charge, you can just slaughter them. As you're really gone. It's like Polish lancers, cavalry.
Yeah.
That's what they basically do.
The Japanese are good, but you have to survive the bonsai charge. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have found games where the Japanese simply didn't make it. But yeah, bonsai charging is a useful tactic. But then again, in bolt action, you can use it for any army.
I don't think I've lost once yet.
We have had a couple of where the bonsai troops got massacred.
That's not lost though.
Yeah, but...
oh yeah, the one where I started the bonsai charge infantry, I've got by tanks.
Yeah. So there we have it. The Soviet army was very well equipped. I should mention that too, as you can tell from the figures. They had a lot of modern kit. Their standard anti-tank gun on the tanks was possibly the most powerful anti-tank gun in existence on a vehicle. And armoured cars also carried the same anti-tank gun. It was kind of a universal Russian anti-tank gun, the 45mm gun. As powerful, if not more powerful, than anything the Germans had. And the best the Germans did was a 37mm Slovakian built anti-tank gun, which was a good anti-tank gun for the period. But yeah, the Russians went in heavily for anti-tank guns, whereas a lot of armies were going in for howitzers and stuff. So yeah, but we will eventually upgrade this army to a slightly later army, about a year later than the time that this is set, and add some KV tanks to it. Yep. The reason I haven't got any KVs at the moment is because we haven't got... Sorry, we're only doing up to the Winter War. So really the KVs didn't start getting used until after that. So we're doing China, Poland, Kathleen Gold, things like that. And so we don't have a place where we can use the KVs. So we will be adding KV tanks to the army when we decide to do Barbarossa.
Yep.
Basically. Right, so anything else?
No, that's everything.
That's everything, right. Well, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you like the look of the army so far. This should be an interesting one. Over to you.
So if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, and comment down below which is your best army that is bolt action do. That's everything from me.
And that's everything from him. Good day.
See ya.